I think on an ad hoc basis. It can still be very, very powerful, but it's not sustained, and there's not a global vision for where people are going, except in the broad ideals, as my friend Saif was talking about when I talked about Tahrir Square.
So Ann, what does the Center for American Progress do specifically to encourage young people to not just participate around issues, but to get out and run for office themselves and try to put that energy behind a young candidacy and make a difference in a city council or in a mayor's office or somewhere else?
Well, I think you identify a really big challenge, which is that, yeah, I agree there's tons of skepticism with institutions, and I think part of the frustration that young people see, whether we're talking about institutions of local government or the federal government, or frankly institutions of the progressive movement, like big institutions that are a part of the progressive movement, is that young people want to be able to get involved in stuff so they can make change on issues. And if you can make change, and if you can make your community better by starting a nonprofit, then that's what people want to do. They want to go be able to actually affect outcomes and to change their environment, their lives, their families' lives. And so when government becomes something that people don't see as a change agent, then why would you want to participate in that? Why would you put your time and energy into doing that? So I think what we have to do is work with people who are committed to making change on specific issues, whether that's homelessness in their community or student debt or college affordability or LGBT rights, and start saying to them, here's what you can do at the local level or at the state level if you were in office. So you have to like sort of flip the power so that they can say, if I was in this position, I would be able to actually implement the change that I want to see in the community. And it's totally challenging. I think a big piece of what has to be done is actually just training. You have to teach people how to run for office, teach people how to write stump speeches and how to write a list of donors and how to start to write a campaign plan and build coalitions. And I think giving people the information that they need to be able to actually start the process of running for office and encourage them to do it and tell them, don't disengage from the process, like actually use it to try to make the change that you want to see and start the nonprofit and do all that. But this is another avenue for our generation to be able to get inside the institutions and push and change them from in.
There are a couple of rules I just wanted to just add to this because they really speak to it. One project that we're working on right now is called Representation 2020, which is about representation of women in office, which has some insights about representation of young people. We have incredible underrepresentation of women. Only 10% of governors, 10% of mayors of our biggest cities. Women are stuck at less than a quarter of the state legislature for the last 20 years, hardly sort of moving. And a lot of it is how people get started and who invites them in and what associations of people are there trying to recruit people. So it's not just about putting yourself forward. It's like being with other people and finding an avenue and women being sought and urged to run early and then sort of getting on that ladder that people rise from state legislature up to governor and so on. And so that I think it's about association. It's about how people come together and how people come together early and how we have kind of more political association for young people gets to this question about how we can maybe use the internet creatively to do that, which what Nate Daschle would have talked more about. But then also access to the system as potential candidates as well. And I'll just finish with one quick story from our own situation here in Maryland, where I have a state legislative district with 3 seats. All of the incumbents ran 4 years ago, and I think there was maybe like one long shot candidate that tried to run against them. This year, one of them stepped down. And there's about 12 candidates running to kind of jump into that position. And they're like 8 really good candidates or something. There is some energy out there, but we often just don't create an outlet for it. And that's where this more fundamental critique we have of actually taking representation and representing geography, the sort of idea of a single member district and one person per area, or a winner-take-all rule where it's 3 people, but the people with the most votes wins. If we had a more porous system where there were more open seats and there was more opportunities to organize and change, you would create sort of opportunities for people to get involved too.
Okay, thank you. Over here.
Hi, Rachel Oswald. I'm a journalist here in DC. Maybe a couple of you caught the essay that ran in the Daily Beast a few weeks back by, I think it was Peter Baynart, where he was making the argument that because of the events that happened in the last decade, the war in Iraq, the failure to respond to Katrina, the failure to prevent the recession, and then the failure to hold the people who caused it accountable, millennials have been shaped irrevocably to be kind of skeptical of small government and kind of pro-populist. But so the essay made that argument pretty strongly, but as I'm sitting here listening to you talk about things, the last question about kind of challenges millennials have in changing institutions. You know, as I'm thinking about if millennials do indeed want to see income inequality reduced, you know, as the Occupy movement strongly indicated, how are they going to maintain momentum against very deeply rooted institutional forces in Wall Street, throughout Congress, throughout the economic policy planning branch of the executive branch? You know, these forces that are strongly, for maintaining, wealth accumulation by, a small percentage of the population.
That's going to be the fascinating tale. They've already proved that they can, on an ad hoc basis, force corporations to reduce their behavior. And the Verizon and the Bank of America $5 debit charge and stuff like that. Now they're also proving that they can require corporations to adhere to social policies they agree with. This young generation has done an enormous amount. For example, the obvious example is Nike not using sweatshops so much, but there's more and more of this, and there are whole organizations now that are dedicated to making sure that any corporation that uses a sweatshop is outed and is talked about on the net. And generally, these corporations scramble pretty hard to try to undo their reputation that they're earning in your generation for exploiting people. Even in politicians, and I talked about before the person who pulled up the cell phone when Mitt Romney made his 47% speech. So it is going to be hard. What we have built in this globalization is a huge, huge corporate interest. I remember when I was in college, one of my friend's fathers, who was very smart, once said, he was a small manufacturer. He had a plant in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania. And he said, by the time you're my age, corporations will be stronger than national governments. And that's by and large true for most, the size of, not this government, but most countries. I think the story of this young generation, the first globals, is going to be undoing some of that corporate power, or at least harnessing it to be more responsible. And it'll be very, very difficult because the corporations clearly have the upper hand right now. I'm just not completely convinced that they always will.
Yes.
Do you think the issue is also that millennials don't realize the power that they actually have outside the system? I mean, we talk a lot about the power of the internet, and we see, for example, startups using crowdfunding to raise money. Is it a question of just millennials building an audience and a voting base prior to even running for office, where you could do that on YouTube, you could crowd vote so that by the time you're actually ready to run for office, you have an established constituency that's just waiting for you? Is it a question of we're still early on in the stage of the power of the internet and what we can do, and that millennials haven't realized that we don't necessarily need the institutions, but we could build outside the institution and then election day bring 200, 300,000 voters to the polls?
Yeah.
Well, I think that this idea of young people realizing their power is incredibly important. I mean, to your comment earlier, like how do you sustain these sort of long-term movements that have happened? I think that like Occupy, the young people that went and were in the park changed the conversation, and they changed the dialogue. Now, whether or not Occupy long-term is what it is and all of that, we can have another conversation. But the reality is that act of sort of pushing the conversation and taking a stand changed the national dialogue. You look at the Dreamers, right? The Dreamers saying this immigration reform or immigration's broken in this country. And not only are we going to talk about the DREAM Act and comprehensive immigration reform, but we're going to go out and protest Barack Obama's campaign offices until the president does something about it. And then lo and behold, deferred action comes. So I think young people push the envelope and push change in a way, whether they're working inside the system or outside the system and pushing the institutions to change. And there, I think we're, as our generation, we're loud, we're vocal. We do have a base of people. We have our Twitter followers, we have our social media networks, we have our friends. We can go out and start a nonprofit and raise money and go do something. And I think once we figure out how to leverage that power to be able to create social change in and outside of the system, more people get excited about it when they realize that they can actually do something about the problems that they see.
So young people organize, and they occasionally can get together and make things happen quickly, which is a wonderful thing when it happens. But is it also a problem when young people sort of expect things to happen quickly, and when they don't, they lose faith?
Yep.
I mean, look at how young folks, many of them have lost faith in the president because change hasn't come as quickly or as surely as they had anticipated.
I think that's a phenomenon of people who are in their 20s. I mean, that's just life in the 20s, right? And I mean, what I always say, my father once said this to me in my 20s, which I thought I was paying no attention, but evidently I was, because here I am repeating it. He said, this was after the sort of the battles that fathers and sons go through, and he said, well, I still have an advantage over you. And I said, what's that? He said, I can look backward as well as forward. And what I see, as I'm now in the 60s, is that 20-year-olds are incredibly impatient, and they do get disappointed, as I did. I dropped out of politics when I was in college and gave up on any aspirations I ever had in the face of the Nixon and the impeachment and all these other things. But I think that's the role of 20-year-olds. You have to be impatient. You have to be angry sometimes. You have to push all the time. And then suddenly you discover that you did, in fact, change the world. So when I was the age of most First Globals, I had 2 African-American roommates when I was in college. The year was 1968. Martin Luther King was killed. Bobby Kennedy was killed. Now, neither of them had gone to school with any white people, and I'd never gone to school with a black person before. They came from segregated schools in the South. And it was a rough year for all of us. We learned a lot. But if you could have asked any of us if 40 years from that time we could have a black president, we all would have told you were crazy. And yet, 40 years later, your generation, and it was your generation that did this. The first election in my lifetime in 2008 where more people under 35 voted than who were over 65. That's just not happened before, at least in this century. So, in fact, when you get to look back, you do realize how fast the change has been, because 40 years is actually pretty fast. So it is true that disappointment and feeling like you don't have power is part of the shtick when you're 20. But to get back to your question, is in fact, I think your generation realizes that you have much more power than our generation thought we did. And we did have a lot of power, because we did, in fact, it took a long time, we did end a war. But your generation has transformed America in ways that you can't possibly imagine, but you'll appreciate more when you get to be my age.
Maybe I'll just add a point about the internet organizing, because I think you're right that that's what may be happening, and you see the self-organizing happen in the presidential level and people like having this impact. But just as a measure, I'll just give people a chance to check it out to see if it begins happening at a congressional level. We have a report out there, if you go to fairvoting.us, about 435 House races and making projections in more than 370 of them where we say they won't change. We basically predict outcomes with a lot of precision. And what I'm going to look for is when we start seeing surprises, when we start seeing an organized effort in a low turnout midterm, right, where a relatively smaller number of voters can move the dial. And then when you're talking about moving from 48 to 51, it's not that huge a shift. But we see very little of those unexpected results, and it'll be interesting to see if people can start organizing in a way using new tools where we see surprises, because right now we're seeing a very static, controlled system.
Let's go all the way up to the top, can we? Over here. We'll come back to you. We'll come back to you.
Hi.
Don't forget the question.
Sorry. That was actually my question was, is there any places, obviously, you've talked a lot about the presidential elections, both in 2004 and 2008, millennials getting involved. Is there any places that you can point to in previous midterm elections that millennials or younger people have turned out at a greater level, and any tactics that have been used in order to better engage them and get them to register more and vote more?
We have a lot of experienced people up here. Former chair of the Democratic Party. Do we have a good example from
Well,
2006?
I mean, the most stunning one was President Obama, and it wasn't all young people, although young people was the biggest surprise. But I mean, he rewrote the map to have Virginia now, and then North Carolina was and will be again because of the behavior of their legislature. I think there's going to be a huge backlash in North Carolina in this election. I think that's not just young people, but there is a sort of a liberating. I mean, I think you're going to see Texas go go blue pretty soon, people are going to say, well, that's because the Latino population is going to become a majority, but it's also because young people in Texas aren't the same as the people who are voting for the kind of folks that are running the place now. I think women are going to have a huge role to play. One of the things I'm going to be interested in to see if Hillary ends up being the nominee is if she motivates young women to come out, because that's going to encourage women candidates all over the place, and that's going to make a big difference. So there are a lot of places. I don't know what this is the last one I'll talk about, and Steve may or may not be familiar with this poll, but apparently there was a poll in Utah. This is 5 weeks after the judge legalized same-sex marriage, and Utah apparently is divided 48-48 on whether same-sex marriage should be allowed or not. Now, I have not seen the internals on that, but you'd really like to know what the age breakdown is. I mean, Salt Lake City is actually a bastion of liberalism. It just isn't big enough to have much of an effect, and the legislature is pretty skillful at drawing lines. But eventually, you can't draw enough lines when the numbers get big enough. So I think this is going on all over the country, and the question is, if you're asking where the marginal races are going to flip, I don't know, but I think if I gave you an answer today, it wouldn't be the same answer 2 years from now.
One thing about the way our system works is where there's particular congregations of young people just
Right.
going to schools or living as recently graduated from college or high school, they tend to be in cities and urban areas and places where actually the congressional races are really non-competitive, right? They're not very interesting. So there might be a primary that could be interesting, but it's really tough to beat incumbents in primaries, and it's hard at this point to get a lot of millennials participating in non-presidential primaries where they actually could have more of an impact. So then the races that really matter are these relatively few, often suburban or sort of more rural districts where you have more stable populations and not as many young people ready to be activated who can have the impact that they have in presidential races or in statewide races where every vote counts.
Let's go over here.
So, Governor Dean, I think I want to give a little bit of voice to those frustrated, impatient 20-year-olds that you were
Good.
referencing
That's what
earlier.
we want. That's
As
what
somebody
changes things.
right in the middle of that decade, I guess, what I'm hearing from a lot of the folks on the panel, and this is a question I guess actually for the whole panel, is that millennials are going to be the generation that changes everything. It's a lot of future tense talk. And yet so much right now that is broken has not changed. There are things that have on specific issues and in particular areas. Tahrir Square is a great example. There's a lot of things going on with marriage equality that are really encouraging. And yet I get the sense, and correct me if I'm wrong, that the system itself writ large is still essentially and fundamentally in important ways broken and has not been fixed. What is the thing for the generation that, no pressure, not to speak in hyperbole, is going to change everything? What is the thing that keeps that in the future tense and is not getting it into the present tense?
I must have
Is it
misspoke.
time?
It already is
yeah.
changing everything.
Yeah.
I mean, look, inner city education is changing dramatically because thousands of young people are doing Teach for America. My son did this. I sort of said, well, what makes you think sticking unskilled white suburban kids in front of minority kids in these schools makes their education any better? He said, maybe it does and maybe it doesn't, but every good charter school in America virtually every good charter school in America has been started by a TFA alum, and it's true. And the education in inner cities is a lot better today. It's got a long way to go, but finally we're making progress 40 years after the civil rights movement. So that's already, and that's your generation. Now, it's true that Wendy Kopp got the idea, and she's not a First Global, but she's not very old either. And she got it as an undergraduate, and she's built this incredible thing. And it's not far from perfect. It's far from perfect, but it really has begun education reform is not coming from the top down. They talk a lot, but they don't really do much. It's coming from the bottom up because people are demanding it. And now people are staying in these schools, and because they're good or better, people now can live in the cities and raise their children in the cities and not fear that their kids are going to have terrible things happen in the school system. Is it perfect? No, but it is changing dramatically. Even, and I'm not a big fan of Michelle Rees, but if you look at the school system in Washington, to fire the worst 1,200 teachers and hike the wages to $85,000 of the best ones, that is a breakthrough. And that wouldn't happen. I mean, Michelle Rees can get some credit for it. I don't particularly like her management style. But the real credit for that goes to the people who were in those schools every single day making it happen, and a hell of a lot of them were under 26 years old. So I would agree that everything, I would say, yeah, you're going to change everything. There's a hell of a lot of stuff that hasn't been changed. The military-industrial complex hasn't been changed a lot, except we have don't ask, don't tell. And the reason we don't have don't ask, don't tell, there's two reasons. First of all, because LGBT people stood up for themselves and said who they were, and they were proud of who they were, which is always what every member of a minority group has to do in order to get themselves taken seriously. And the other was this entirely different attitude that your generation has towards what it means to be gay or lesbian or bisexual or transgender. And that really did force the military to deal with it. And interestingly, everybody thinks the military is this conservative organization, blah, blah, blah. Don't forget, the military was the first institution in America that desegregated in 1948 when Harry Truman did that by executive order. So there are a lot of things that are changing now. We haven't gotten even to the tipping point, but we have gotten so far, and we're going to get to the tipping point, and then we're just going to see how far we can go to change things.
But also the answer is sitting right to your left, or the question is sitting to your left, which is when millennials start to run for office and they start to win, things are going to start to change more quickly. And Rob was talking about the field of 12 in Tacoma Park for 3 seats, which didn't exist the last time 3 seats were available. Are there any of those candidates who are under 30?
If they're not under 30, they're close. There's a bunch of people who are like at least 25 to 35, and that's sort of the mold of almost all of them. And it's quite challenging because there's like, wow, there's like 8 really interesting candidates, and there's only 1 or 2 are going to win. Yeah.
I would also say this change is totally happening now. I mean, I think we are seeing the results of young people being active and engaged and pushing institutions. I'm also a huge believer in scheming. Right? I think that we have to be a really smart, strategic generation in thinking about how we talk to each other about long-term system change and how we work together about long-term system change. We've been working on a campaign around student debt for like 2 years, and the campaign is launching on March 6th. 2 years of conversations and of like people getting together and saying the system of higher education in the United States is so colossally in need of change. That there's so much debt, there's so many sort of players who are making so much money off the system, and it's a big beast. And to figure out how you change a long-term, like a big system like that, takes some really sophisticated long-term organizing. So I think while rapid response, big, fast campaigns are important and needed when things are happening, we also have to be smart and strategic about long-term change. And if that means like get the 10 or 15 or 20 or 30 smartest people together and start having conversations about, okay, like in 20 years when we're running all of this stuff, if we're not running it now, how are we going to behave differently? How are we going to do things differently? How are we going to change the system? And let's start doing it now, because like 5 years goes by fast and 10 years goes by fast, and pretty soon all of the people in this room are running stuff. And then you all know each other and you have relationships with each other, and you can actually push from both inside and outside of the system. So scheme a lot.
Let's go over to this side again. Why don't we come down all the way? Just yell if there's no microphone handy.
Thank you, sir. Hi, good evening. My name is Dash. I'm a student at American University, and I'm also a community organizer. My question is, and a big challenge we have, is we've seen in the last few years, we've seen what happens at the state level and at the local level when the wrong people get elected to office. I'm also from New York, and we see what happens when the right people get elected to the office at the local level. How do we engage millennials to vote in local and state level elections, and not just once because they like a dynamic candidate, but to keep them voting time and time again?
Great question.
Yeah, it's such a good question. I'll just add a couple things, but there's no one answer to this one. But part of it is we have to transform what we know about local elections and local government. And New York City has a lot of media there, but a lot of localities have worse and worse media, or media that fewer and fewer people see. It might be newspapers are in such a difficult position, and we haven't really transitioned into what's next. I think that we could do a lot more in our schools to talk about local government, but also talk about how we can connect into government. We have a specific proposal that just is an example of a structural change that can do something. Is in our town, we moved to 16-year-old voting, which is actually becoming an international norm, or not. It's not a norm yet, but I think it's heading that direction. We've seen several countries do that nationally. The UK will probably do it in just a couple of years. They're doing it now in Argentina and Austria and so on. But the thing that's interesting about that change is that it means that when you're in high school, some people are starting to get to vote. And you're in your community. You haven't gone off where you're in a more displaced place. And so we did it in our town. The turnout among 16 and 17-year-olds was twice as high of eligible voters as it was for 18 and up. And part of it was novel and exciting and kind of interesting to do, but also, they're there. And we hope that participation will change, and that could be done at a local level. Maybe don't do that yet for state and national. We might at some point, but that's not a be-all, end-all answer. But it's the kind of thing that we should look at.
I think also we have to not wait for candidates to come talk to us and go push ourselves into the electoral process. And I think, I do a lot of training with young people who are going to getting involved in political organizing, and I always tell people, think about doing politics the same way you would plan a party, right? If I were planning a party at my house, I would not walk around and pass out flyers to strangers that I'd never seen before. Or I wouldn't just put up an event on Facebook and hope that some random people would show up, right? If I was having a party at my house, I would figure out who I wanted to invite, I would call them, I would confirm them over email, I would text them, I would make sure that my friends were coming at a certain time so I wasn't there by myself. I mean, we know how to organize, and if you take all that context and if you take that work and put it into a political context, that's a really good field program right there. So I think if we have to think about engaging our generation in local elections using what we know about how we turn out our friends in all the other parts of our lives. And if we sit back and wait for candidates to come to us, then they're always going to say, well, those young people don't vote, they don't turn out as much, and it's the cyclical problem. So I think if we make a commitment to talking to our own generation about the political process and participation, that we can actually go run the kinds of campaigns that we know how to run and get young people engaged and involved and get them the information that they need to participate.
So we only have time. Let me just tell you that we're going to end this after one more question, but we're going to all move upstairs and have a little drink and fellowship. So anybody who has a question that we don't get to can ask it when we get upstairs, okay? So the next question is going to go to right in the middle.
Hard one.
This woman right here in the middle.
Hi, my name is Caitlin, and I'm from St. Mary's College in Notre Dame, Indiana. And you've talked a lot about First Globals and how they're really sharing these broader ideas of democracy and civic engagement across the world and across state borderlines. And I'm wondering if you could kind of talk about how ways and we could be more effective in doing that and working on an international basis, because I think a lot of us have an international focus.
It's very hard because, you may think the Congress doesn't do much, but how'd you like to be living in Ukraine or Russia or Egypt right now? The forces that want to do things the old way are very, very strong. And especially in countries where the democracy, having a democracy which mostly permits gradual change so that the forces of conservatism don't have to give up everything all at once, it's easier here. Hard as that is to believe, it is easier here because democracies, while they're slow, they are flexible. That's less true in a lot of places that aren't democracy. There are an enormous number of things you can do, and I'll tell you one of them. I'll give you an example. There was a young lady who graduated from LaGuardia High School in New York, went to the University of Vermont, went to South Sudan when she was 18, came to the realization that the way America did foreign aid made people more dependent, not less dependent, started our own foreign aid organization called Sparks Microgrants, got together with 2 or 3 friends. They now expanded to Burundi and Uganda, and so they have 3 places where they basically send people into the field, local people. They hire local college graduates, many of whom can't find jobs, send them into the field. They're not allowed to suggest anything to the villages. They basically find out what they want, get them to create the structures of how they're going to do what they want, how they're going to maintain it. They get a one-time small grant. Now, this is life-changing. Not only are they going to get a bridge or a school or whatever it is, they're going to be in charge of it, they're going to run it, and the whole village authority structure comes, because usually what happens in these places where the men run everything and the women do all the work is the men come, they they talk a lot, the women come, they don't say much, and as things go on, the women are the ones that solve the problems, and then the women end up running it. So this is this is life-changing. And in some ways, in an international, and what I tell her, because I help her make this institutional transition, because she doesn't want to spend her whole time filling out forms for health insurance now that she has 100 employees, what I tell her is, stay out of politics. Do not get involved. Do not piss off Kagame in Rwanda. You're already changing Rwanda more than anybody could imagine simply by changing the authority structure in the village. And that's really how you do this. And in many ways, especially now, even in the United States, change never comes from the top down. It just never does. And people who think it does always get disappointed. How many of you thought Obama was going to change everything? Now, Obama, you will find out about 15 years from now that Obama actually changed a whole lot more than you thought he did. That's true. But it's frustrating to you because you think that the pace should be much faster. And as 20-year-olds, that's your job, is to demand faster. I want you to keep doing that, otherwise it'll never happen. So the whole world can be changed. There is this wish out there to do it. All these kids from Rwanda and Uganda and Burundi that are changing this, they're all learning a whole different way of doing things, and this is going to just magnify, and it's not going to go away. And yes, you can repress it with violence, but you can't turn the clock back on what people believe. And what they say, which of course has been said for many years, is you can kill a human being, but you can't kill the idea. And this idea, I think, has continued to go further. So, I'm not even that. I'm going to Skype with Saif sometime in the next couple of days to find out. I think El-Sisi running for president of Egypt is certainly not a step forward. But I'm going to find out what his take on it, because I doubt very much that he's given up hope. And your generation is disinclined to give up hope, as far as I can tell, because you've had a lot of success already, and you can continue to have it.
Okay, so Rob and Governor, thank you so much for coming. Thank all of you for coming. We'll see you upstairs in a minute. How about that?